As a Canadian citizen who happens to be vaccinated or unvaccinated, can you travel? Can you re-enter the country? What are the conditions under which you can do that, come back to your own home country? In normal times, those conditions were few. In the COVID 1984 era, there's a lot of conditions. People have been asking me about them, so today I'm going to give a bit of a summary of the current state of the law as it pertains to trying to get back into your home country. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So today I'm going to do a summary because there's lots of laws. I can't go through everything, but I'm going to go through the key points of the current state of the law as it pertains to people trying to get back into Canada. That being Canadian citizens getting back into Canada. Now, I say the current state of the law because this is changing very frequently. So this video will be current to the 27th of July, 2022. But if you're watching this video a month later, a couple months later, it may be out of date. However, some of the changes are subtle. I've looked back at the laws that we'll be discussing going back a few months, and they're pretty similar over that time period. So we're going to have a look at the Quarantine Act and then specifically the regulations that have been passed by Order in Council. Now, this seems to be a favorite tactic of implementing what I would call tyranny in the last couple of years, and that's using orders in council because it doesn't have to go through Parliament. It doesn't have to go through the onerous process of there being debate and a vote and elected representatives deciding on what the law should be, binding citizens. Order in Council is, in theory, an order made by the Governor General. However, as I've mentioned in previous videos, the reality of the Canadian system is that the Governor General really just does whatever the Prime Minister tells him or her to do. So we have a situation where really all power, executive power and legislative power, are largely invested in one person. But be that as it may, let's have a look. I'm going to look at the Quarantine Act first, because the Quarantine Act is the thing that is giving the power to these regulations and is controlling people's ability to enter the country. Now, before I look at the act, I just want to pause and mention that this really isn't anything that new to have requirements to enter the country. You'll see some people on YouTube show the passport where it says that this person must be granted entry, and they'll say, see, this is proof. You don't have to answer anything. You don't have to do anything. Well, I think we all know that's not true, because for years and years and decades, when you come back into the country, you have to tell the CBSA officer where you've been, what you were doing there, and what you bought before you can come back into the country. So these quarantine measures are somewhat of an extension of that, and really the Quarantine Act's been around for a long time. So the mere fact of having to answer questions or provide information to border guards isn't particularly new. What is new is some of the very specific requirements and the circumstances in which these requirements are put in place. So I'm going to start us off with the Quarantine Act. It's a federal statute, and I'm going to go right to Section 58, because this is the section where the emergency orders come to play, and this is the section that people are being charged under if they don't answer questions, they don't provide proof of certain procedures having been done to them. So Section 58 sub 1 says that the Governor and Council may make an order prohibiting or subjecting to any condition the entry into Canada of any class of persons who have been in a foreign country or a specified part of a foreign country if the Governor and Council is of the opinion that A, there is an outbreak of a communicable disease in the foreign country, and B, the introduction or spread of the disease would pose an imminent and severe risk to the public health in Canada. C, the entry of members of that class of persons into Canada may introduce or contribute to the spread of the communicable disease in Canada. And D, no reasonable alternative to prevent the introduction or spread of the disease are available. Now, I think there's certainly room for debate as to whether all the parts of that test apply. Section A probably applies, that there's a communicable disease. I think that where the issues come in is would allowing people into the country without quarantining them in the face of COVID-19 pose an imminent and severe risk to Canada? I think there's also a live question of, is not allowing unvaccinated people into the country, or at least not allowing them back in under the same circumstances as vaccinated, actually going to pose a risk. I think there's a lot of evidence now, although Health Canada has never admitted this, the CDC in the United States certainly has, that the COVID-19 vaccines don't actually stop transmission, in which case that part of Section 58 wouldn't be met. And whether there's alternate means, that may be a question, but the fact of the matter is, if you don't follow these regulations that I'm going to go into, you most likely will be charged under Section 58 of the Act. So it's important to be aware of that and be aware of what the consequences could be. Now, I'm certainly aware that there's a number of people on the internet and elsewhere, even people that I've met in person, that say, well, I made it through the border, no problem. I didn't have to have ArriveCan. I didn't have to test. I didn't have to say anything. That may or may not have been the case. So, I mean, there's a lot of people crossing the border, so I'm sure, and border guards have a certain level of discretion, so people might be able to, but I've also been consulted by clients who've received tens of thousands of dollars in fines for trying to cross the border and just insisting on their rights and suggesting to the border guards that they don't have to follow any of these regulations because of that. It's not a practice that, from a legal perspective, I can recommend, because you could be facing literally tens of thousands of dollars of fines if you do that, and that's a situation that a lot of people can't afford to be in. So let's take a look at the order in council that's in effect here. So this is the current one here, PC number 2002-0836. It's an order in council made on June the 25th of 2022. So that's still current. That's the most recent order that's been made in relation to COVID-19. And you can just see that the preamble here is saying that where the governor and council is of the opinion, based on the declaration of the pandemic by the World Health Organization, there is an outbreak of a communicable disease, namely COVID-19, and therefore under Section 15 of the Quarantine Act, these regulations are being made. So again, we're just going to do a quick summary of some of the most important points here. So under Division 2, we have COVID-19 tests. So this is where the requirement that you do a COVID-19 test is laid out. So if you're entering by aircraft, every person who enters Canada by aircraft must, before boarding the aircraft for the flight to Canada, provide to the aircraft operator evidence of a COVID-19 molecular test or evidence of a COVID-19 antigen test, indicating that they received negative result, etc. I think the important point here, molecular test, that's PCR test. Antigen test, that's the rapid antigen test. That's outlined in the definitions section of this order. Then entering by land, every person must, who's entering Canada by land under Section 12 here, have in their possession evidence of a COVID-19 molecular test or evidence of a COVID-19 antigen test indicating that they received a negative result collected no more than 72 hours before entering Canada, a negative result for a test that was performed outside of Canada on a specimen collected the day before the day in which they entered Canada, a positive result for a test that was collected at least 10 days and no more than 180 days before they entered Canada. So if you had a positive test, it has to have been more than 10 days before you're coming to Canada. And you must provide upon request the evidence referred to in paragraph A to the Minister of Health, screening officer, or quarantine officer. Now, I think that brings up the question of the ArriveCan app. I see all over government websites the claim that ArriveCan is mandatory. Now, I've searched high and low through these orders in council and through various laws to see, is there actually a law that says you must have ArriveCan? I can't find a law that says you must specifically have ArriveCan. Now, it appears that ArriveCan is the manner in which they prefer or want you to provide the information that we've just covered that you have to provide, but it doesn't appear that it's absolutely mandatory to use ArriveCan. The people that I've consulted with that have been charged, it hasn't been for not having ArriveCan, it's for not having the information that goes into ArriveCan. Now that said, you can log into the public health website, you can log into ArriveCan before you go. If I were to travel, which I'm not traveling right now because I don't want to deal with all this stuff, but if I were to travel, that's the route I would take. I would log in ahead of time. I wouldn't even bring a smartphone with me to the border. Just carrying on, Section 15 sub 1 says that subject to the following sections. Every person who enters Canada must, in accordance with the instructions of quarantine officer, undergo a COVID-19 molecular test when entering Canada and after entering Canada. Now, this is these random tests that you may have heard about in the news under subsection 3. It says, on request made in a randomized manner, the Chief Public Health Officer, a person referred to in Section 2, or a member of a class of those persons must, during the 14-day period that begins on the day in which the person enters Canada, undergo a COVID-19 molecular test in accordance with the instructions of a quarantine officer or the Minister of Health. So they can show up to where you're quarantining and force you to take a PCR test. You don't have to answer the door, but you could get charged under Section 58 if you don't let them do this PCR test. Although granted, I think a $4,000 fine to me would be preferable to having a thing jammed basically back into my brain, but I'd rather not be facing a $4,000 fine, period. Well, this video is getting a little bit long, so I'm going to break it into 2 parts so that you're not stuck listening to me drone on. And we'll come back next week and we'll finish this up with more points to consider. But I think we've already got some important things to consider. And just as a closing note for this week's episode, I would say that we'll get a little bit into the charter next episode, but I think the bottom line is until these laws are challenged in court, the law as it stands is going to be enforced by CBSA and PHAC agents. So govern yourself accordingly. Be aware that even though you may feel very strongly that these laws are not consistent with our Constitution, they'll still be enforced, and you could be at risk of facing very significant fines if you choose not to follow these laws. This video isn't legal advice. If you need legal advice, call a lawyer. You can call another lawyer or myself. My phone number and website are listed below. If there's topics you'd like to see me cover, please send an email to the email address listed below or leave a comment in the comment section. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and following us on social media.